Like a trusted turnout jacket you've had for years, Flex 7 outer shell fabric delivers a perfectly broken-in feel on the very first wear. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of Enforce technology, Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tenkatafabrics.com/flex7. Flex 7, powered by Enforce technology. Only from Tenkata Protective Fabrics.
Taking It to the Streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions dedicated to both the art and science of firefighting and the traditions of the fire service. The focus at Taking It to the Street continues to be straightforward, street-level talk with intelligent, stimulating, and provocative insights and dynamic discussion with interactive dialogue and, most importantly, listener participation. Just like around the kitchen table or in the day room over a cup of coffee at 02:30 after a good run. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum.
Welcome to this edition of Buildings on Fire's Taking It to the Streets. On your street, in your city, across the country, and around the world. Taking It to the Streets is a monthly radio talk show program on fireengineering.com, and I'm your host, Christopher Naum. As always, our heartfelt welcome to our dedicated and loyal program listeners, and to our ever-expanding followers, and our newest listeners, as well as our dedicated followers across the board. So again, Taking It to the Streets, it's all about advancing operational excellence and decisive engagement for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions focusing in on the built environment. So again, welcome to this edition of Buildings on Fire, Taking It to the Streets. We started off a conversation in our last episode, actually our last two episodes. We had an opportunity. Our last episode was part one of our two-part series talking about building construction training, sort of focusing in on some of the aspects of training for the fire service in your respective positions, whether it be at the firefighter, fire officer, or the commander levels of responsibility. But talking a little bit more from a focus standpoint about some of the training issues, a little bit of historical context, as well as possibly and suggesting some change-ups to the type of training that we conduct, as well as the manner that we conduct it, whether it be in the classroom or, as we say, taking the classroom to the streets. We'll talk a little bit more about that and conclude with some different insights pertaining to, again, how do I attain appropriate level of training for my roles and responsibilities in my organization that have everything to do with the built environment. Some of you may have already listened in and have some insights from our last two programs. As I mentioned, our last episode in the month of April, we started off our first part of this two-part series talking about some of the aspects, a little bit of insights on some training. We talked about some of the earliest textbooks that have been written pertaining to building construction, and we'll reinforce some of those things here on this episode. But again, the other episode that was sort of in the middle, sort of a bookend to our two episodes here, was our live program presentation that we produced and facilitated live from the floor at FDIC. And that was during FDIC week. Had a phenomenal opportunity to present again at FDIC with a 4-hour workshop. And we culminated the week at the end of that week doing a live program right from the floor, talking about Buildings on Fire and really talking about some specifics of building construction, tactics, operation. And in that particular episode, talked a little bit more about construction sites and some of the related issues from the ground up. And one of our guest speakers that we actually had the opportunity to reconvene and discuss was Captain Mike Wallingford from Jefferson Township, Kentucky, Fire and Rescue, just in the Louisville area. And along with Mike, we had Assistant Chief Doug Klein, who's well known here on our program, as well as on his program, for fire and training with Chief Klein from Horry County, South Carolina. So the three of us had a conversation talking about some building construction related issues, tactics, operations, some risk factors, some considerations dealing and focusing in with our conversation on the built environment. That actually ties into one of our archived programs that we did specifically talking about construction site fires, talking about fire collapse, rescue operations, and that was our conversation on the construction site fires operational challenges that we did in June of 2023. So if you have an opportunity to go back into the archives, again, we did a very robust conversation with Mike Wallingford and Chief Klein specific to construction site related issues, which again continue to be an evolving adverse trend, an adverse area that conversations continue to be discussed and we talked about, but we continue to see the types of fire events that are occurring specific to construction site fires, along with everything in between. And again, when we talk about construction site fires, there are two specific areas that one should be aware of relative to some NFPA codes and standards that pertain to those, and those would be inclusive of the NFPA 1620 standard for pre-incident planning, along with the NFPA 220 standard for safeguarding, NFPA 241 standard, the standard for safeguarding construction, alterations, and demolition operations. So some good insights, along with understanding building types, which is the NFPA 220 standard that I just made mention of. So a couple of things to look at for our conversation as we lean into our discussion here on this particular episode. So one of the things that we started talking about in part one of our program, and as we are concluding here with our second part series, but our episode really is going to talk again more on the issues affecting the skill sets that we are looking to develop as they relate to the fireground. Fireground influencers, again, are twofold. When we talk about the built environment, we talk about building construction, and again, they all directly influence everything we do on the fireground. They influence decision making. We talk about the built environment, building construction, construction related issues, occupancy type, occupancy risk. Those are all our continuing areas and significant data points or domains that are contributing to our ability to operate on the fireground, and again, to address the variety of emerging issues, challenges, operational aspects that affect our fireground arrival and are dictated by fireground priorities, but also are directly influenced by the built environment. When we take a look at much of what's occurring, we take a look at issues affecting structural integrity, the compartment performance, time considerations. We've had quite a bit of conversation both in our podcasts, our webinars, as well as information that we've been putting out on our social media posts and pages that all revolve around the tactical windows of operations that are all dictated, all significantly influenced by the built environment, by the structure, the building construction, the features within that particular building, and how they relate back to the firefighting impacts of both strategical aspects, but more importantly, the tactical and task level considerations. One of the things that you should be aware of, and certainly by now you should be aware of it, that there are some considerations when we talk about the science of firefighting and some of the new school insights that are being derived from and influenced by different conversations that are occurring, both online as well as conversations in the training environment, classroom environment, the conference environment. It's certainly no different than what transpired at FDIC here recently, last month, when we got into conversations and the types of presentations. If you take a look at the agendas and the programs that were being presented, although there were not a significant number, which again is reflective of what is commonly occurring throughout the United States, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. But when you take a look at the context of topical areas that were presented specific to building construction related issues, certainly far less than some other topical areas which again undermines and underscores the importance, the true importance of how critical insights are on building construction, and sometimes even more so than some of the other topical areas. Now, recognize this, and before you sort of get everything in a knot, one of the things that is so critical in the big picture, the big scheme, certainly when we take a look at the broad base of what is or what are some of the most critical functional domains, areas of, focal areas, when we talk about fireground operations. But again, in the context of structural fireground operations, the most critical level of insights and knowledge base, KSAs, that one needs to have, attain, and be competent on, and that is the aspects of building construction. How is that structure that we are preparing to engage into, work around, on top, underneath, but certainly when we talk about interior or fireground related operations, it has everything to do with that building. And the more knowledge that you have, both in terms of accurate building intel, along with a clear and decisive and solid foundation, both of the basics as well as the advanced levels of insights and knowledge of how that building is built, the insights of building performance. As I mentioned before, the predictability performance of buildings is pretty straightforward. All buildings are predictable in their nature of construction if we understand some fundamentals that go within and revolve around that particular building, its occupancy, the era and vintage in which it's built, that all certainly influence, I'll say again, in a more conservative manner, the true influencers that influence our tactics, influence our task in terms of our operations, and certainly, without question, influence our decision making. And to get into a level of dialogue and discussion or disagreement, it's certainly not something that can be defended. It's certainly something very safe to say when we say that building construction is as fundamental to structural firefighting as water is to fire suppression. Again, understanding that built environment. But again, there's some old school principles conflicting with new sciences. And what I was leading into here a moment ago was, again, when we take a look at some new insights coming about that try to tie in research, insights, influencers, suggested practices that are being derived out of and being published from leading research that comes out from the latest studies and the latest types of experimentation that's occurring, and much of that revolves around one new particular type of guide. And I would encourage our listeners there, if you've never heard about this particular guide, I would encourage you to go to the NFPA website and take a look online. So it still is accessible. The guide is accessible for a read only. You can't print it, and you can't copy or do anything from it, but you can at least read it online. And that would be the NFPA 1700 guide. It was issued quietly in 2021 during COVID, and that is the guide for structural firefighting, strategy, tactics, tasks, supported by science-based research. So again, a very insightful document. It does align with some areas that align with our building facts model, and that building facts model is, again, first arriving, construction, tactics, and safety. So again, some aspects toward that. Since we are talking a little bit about old school, new school, again, I mentioned about some of the old school principles conflicting with new science and some of the emerging conversations, the emerging theories, some of the emerging flavors of the day, for better words, with those that are out there advocating certain perspectives and so forth. There are some things that do fundamentally go back to clear, definitive bases when we talk about building construction, and that is part of the challenges when we continue to utilize old methodologies that don't clearly align with emerging practices or applications, as well as new emerging aspects toward design the methodologies and methods and practices of construction. We talk about modern methods of construction or modern materials of construction, either one of those two contexts. There's a lot going on, and much of our old ways of thinking regarding curriculum-based aspects, training, it fundamentally defaults back to the 5 fundamental building types. And even with that, it's safe to say that the American Fire Service is functionally illiterate and knows, and again, in a generalization, again, just recognize that we're talking about a generalization here, is that the American Fire Service continues to exhibit signs of being functionally illiterate when in fact we know enough to get by, but not nearly enough to really advance some of the insights that are coming from a variety of different sources regarding the dynamics of today's unique fireground, which is different than yesterday's fireground. But I'll say this, I've got a couple of things that we'll talk about here, talking about yesterday's structural fireground that'll lead into this conversation about training and possibly suggesting some different insights on curriculum areas, or if nothing else, some focus areas, which again align with many other programs that we've presented that are published and archived away, as well as our writings, as well as our presentations that we continue to do nationally and internationally. But again, I'll mention this on a couple of things. When we talk about Buildings on Fire, we talk about structural firefighting and yesterday's firegrounds that have relevancy here to the development of knowledge, skills, and abilities, training. Again, it's safe to say, and I will say it's safe to say because of my extensive travels and involvement nationally from a variety of different regions, from East Coast to West Coast, North to South, on a continuous basis. And again, just this anecdotal insights that come about from the Q&As, just some simple questioning, the kinds of feedback that come through the presentations when there are interactive presentations and lectures, the seminars, as well as the continuing things that we have been doing across the United States, dealing with our reading the buildings, taking the classroom to the street types of venues and presentations, where again we are within the built environment in the streets, looking physically at building construction and features and considerations. And when one poses questions to the student audiences that's present with us, that are walking the streets and looking at buildings and such, when certain questions are presented or posed, the responses and the replies in many instances are inaccurate, incomplete, or completely lacking. And by that, we're saying that there is a lack of fundamental baseline knowledge attained through training or reinforced and developed through both in-service training, in-service drills, other programmatic opportunities, whether it be at the conference, local, regional, or national level opportunities, that individuals, first and foremost, are not taking building construction classes for a variety of reasons. Either they feel that they know enough already through Firefighter 1 and 2. They feel as though that they're getting enough, which typically is inaccurate in terms of in-service training, which again, we continue to see some significant gaps nationally. Now recognize this, that there are some very stellar, exceptional training programs across the United States, pocketed with many jurisdictions and fire department organizations and companies and such, but not nearly enough. We do not see a consistency nationally in terms of the degree and depth of training, the degree and depth of education, the degree and depth of consistent, focused training on the emerging and evolving areas of building construction. So again, when we talk about being functionally illiterate, we know enough to get by, but not nearly enough to handle with the continuing evolving issues surrounding the built environment, both new and old, and especially when we talk about new emerging construction methodologies, practices, new types of materials, new types of building sciences, the continuing trend dealing with hybrid structures, in particular, that challenges conventional size up, continually challenges our ability to either identify with a degree of accuracy or even to postulate and make assumptions, accurate assumptions with a higher degree of accuracy on what that building read may be, not only in terms of the building, the occupancy, its risk, but again, construction features, building elements that all create a structure in which we are responding and typically engaging with some degree of evolving fire conditions. And again, we're talking about the structural fire ground. So I'll talk about a couple of quick things here, and you may have heard this before in some of our other sessions, but again, it's worth a couple of minutes of conversation and just reviewing these things when we talk about structural firefighting based upon yesterday's fire ground, which again lays further groundwork out here for our current conversation. So when we talk about yesterday's fire ground, common identifiable building construction and methods of construction. Buildings behave, the rules of firefighting were pretty simple operations, simple tactics, direct engagement. And that was based upon just understanding some of what became very common, especially out of the NFPA 220 standard specific to building typing. And again, just recognize this is that if we talk about building typing from that standpoint first came about in the early 1950s, and those early 1950s established specific criteria for the typing of our buildings. Prior to that, the typing of structures was far different. And although we won't get into that conversation here on this episode, we have addressed some of the aspects of era and vintage regarding the typing of structures and how the typing of structures, again, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the development and the publication of the first building codes or building standards that came about through the National Board of Fire Underwriters in the 1900 and then again in 1915. But subsequently, there were a number of key timeframes in the 30s and again in the late 40s and into the 50s, but not until the mid to late 1960s did we see some significant changes, and then those changes have continued all the way up to today, where we have the International Building Code, the International Code Council, the International Fire Code, some consistencies across the United States with performance-based codes and how they relate back to the variety, again, the continued variation and variety of buildings, the introduction of a variety of construction and materials that, again, challenge conventional wisdom when we relate that back to what fundamentally were the first publications of textbooks dealing with building construction, and then the development of the standard curriculums that continue to be either outdated or significantly challenged relative to the up-to-date content that should be present, but are continuing to be, I guess for better words, not updated in a consistent, timely manner, which leads to these kinds of conversations. So one of the best ways to obtain some accuracy and up-to-date information is not only through our podcast and our webcast that we're doing here on fire engineering, but also the wealth of information that is being published online on fireengineering.com, as well as the information that's being published on Fire Engineering Magazine, the presentations at FDIC, as well as many of the other pod and webcasts that are part of the fireengineering.com podcast program series. Again, there's always something worthwhile to listen to in the context of a variety of different presentations, as well as presenters, our colleagues that are out there talking about strategy and tactics and operations, and even to some extent fireground leadership. There's always some little nugget that comes about as it relates back to the built environment and fireground operations and so forth. So I just made mention again about the aspects of simple operations, tactics, and direct engagement. They were relatively simple because our buildings followed a pretty well set standard that revolved around both architecture, engineering, building sciences, and in terms of the manner in which buildings were being constructed. And therefore, the variations in our buildings came about through adaptive reuse or the reutilization or the changes in occupancy type, occupancy usages, tenant spaces, and so forth, renovations and so forth and such. Simple operations, simple tactics, direct engagement, prescriptive construction-based tactics. Fire dynamics typically matched fire suppression. Our process, our models, and our practices aligned to those. Time was not such a critical issue as it has become today when we talk about fire dynamics and true fire dynamics within a building relative to fire behavior. But time certainly was not an issue. It is a very, very critical issue today, which gets back into the size up and being able to comprehend, identify, project, postulate, predict, and assume or know, again, what that building is all about. And again, it's safe to say this in terms of that conversation piece and those bullets is that buildings allowed us to do our job. Buildings allowed us to conduct ourselves in a way that was developed and honed over many, many decades of time, but it became the consistency of our work practices, certainly throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But as we got into the last, certainly 20 years within the 2000s, the era of the 2000s, the built environment and buildings are not allowing us to do our job or are significantly challenging us regarding, again, methods and materials of modern construction, a variety of different other aspects coupled with fire dynamics. Again, just another critical piece of information. We constantly connect three distinctive areas when we talk about the built environment that also affect our training environment, and that is understanding and comprehending the influencers of the building, understanding the influence of the compartment, and what the compartment is typically the location in which fire will originate and develop and propagate and further challenge our operations. But it's all about the building, it's all about the compartment, it's all about the company. And the company level is, again, knowledge, skills, proficiencies. It's the human performance element that we continue to interject and to add value to our conversation. It's understanding everything about what the company can or can't do, limitations as well as capabilities. But as we've mentioned in many of our previous programs and our conversations on some other podcast programs that revolve around human performance, and there are a number, although not extensive, there are a few other of our colleagues out there talking about human performance. I've been actively involved in human performance related applications on a variety of different scalar basis over the last 20 plus years. But again, it continues to be a rather uncharted area. Our previous conversations did occur slightly just leading into that in the 1980s and early 1990s, talking about some of the aspects of fireground performance. When we talked about crew resource management, those were one of the earliest conversations dealing with human performance. But I still believe that we have a tremendous of on-ground or uncharted area to talk more about human performance. But again, as it relates to fireground operations, human performance, company level performance are locked in very specifically hand in hand. Yesterday's fireground, personnel knew and did their jobs, proficiency, discipline, rigor, and mission above all, clear expectations, simple technology, manual, physical, brute force, and determinations. We had time, we had people, we could mess up and still live on the fireground. We could not know our jobs and still be part of the job, part of the team. We could get away with it, and it was acceptable. That's just the way things operated. We were slow to change. Change was discussed, debated, vetted, accepted, and then implemented. We embraced tradition while we were making it. But again, when we take that step back or we take that moment to pause, again, the question at hand is how much do you truly know about your built environment? How much do you personally know about building construction? You, your partner, as part of your company. How about your station, your shift, your personnel on the various shifts, the individuals within the confines of your department, your organization, again, whether it be volunteer, career, or combination. And again, complexities from a metro-sized urban organization all the way to the rural settings of our environments. Again, there's some things that are fundamental, and what we consistently see through our engagement nationally with organizations, again, from all sides, from the rural to the urban and metro setting is that even in the rural setting, or excuse me, even in the metropolitan urban environment, where the frequency and the severity of alarms and the conduct of operations demands a very high skill set and proficiency level, fundamentally, some personnel at all ranks, at the firefighter, company, command, and certainly at the incident command level, the highest levels at the divisional or executive levels, are lacking the fundamentals. They are still riding on the coattails of what they may have learned back in a different era or generation of time when they first got on the job, but continue to sort of lose touch or lose some of the true connection with what's emerging today. It's very easy to show up on the fire ground, stretch the line, and go in. We get into this manual level of manual, physical, brute force, and determination. That does get the job done, but we've got to have that knowledge set. So one of the things that continues to influence our conversations on training is that, again, we fall or default back to building construction type tactics, occupancy type tactics, tactically driven or fire driven operations, or sometimes even procedurally driven operations. And we're almost on an autopilot mode that gets into that particular aspect. One of the things, and again, I'll take an opportunity here to recite a very interesting quote, and this quote is as follows. Each year, a sizable percentage of the number of firefighters killed is the result of structural collapse. There are cases on record where the deaths from collapse were a direct result of faulty size-up by officers because of their lack of knowledge of building construction, fire behavior, and the rate of water application needed. And that is not of a current conversation, or excuse me, it's not of a current quote that one could say it was recently attributed to some individual within the last few years, but that quote again comes from Chief Lloyd Lehman, who published that in his 1951 edition of Firefighting Tactics. So again, we still are talking about challenges that were present in 1951, just as they are present here in 2024. Building construction, fire behavior, the rate of water application needed, along with many other aspects to that. One of the other important things that is important to make reference to at this particular point here, when we talk about real-world insights, one of the leading root cause attributes. So when we take a look at the University of Georgia study that occurred a few years back, taking a look at a root cause analysis of the four leading issues that are contributors to today's fireground challenges, especially when we talk about line of duty deaths. One of the root causes to that was the inadequate preparation for or the anticipation of adverse events during fireground operations. And it included in that was, again, knowledge of building construction, building related performance issues, which goes back to, again, building, compartment, and company, and more importantly, goes back to the four fundamental reads that we have always consistently attributed that is part of our building facts model, revolving around, again, reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the compartment, and then again, reading the company. So some consistent aspects to that. I think it's safe to say, as we've mentioned in the past, that the built environment is developing developing faster with greater complexity and with greater hazards and risks to firefighting than our tactical models and our level of skill set is providing for, and that becomes part and parcel of the overall problem. So when we take a look at education and training, certainly when we discuss one of the most recent books for many of us, again, if you've been involved in the fire service for the last 40 plus years and are still actively engaged and involved, especially for many of you that have that many years of experience, typically you are operating at a high level of command or organizational oversight at the executive level of departments, or again are operating as a deputy fire chief that has that wealth of experience. But certainly when we talk about one of the first consistently recognized books for training that took us from a different era, almost the dark ages of fire training, and started really providing some focus and consistency. And that was the late Francis Brannigan's Building Construction for the Fire Service book. The first edition that was published in 1971 consisted of 9 chapters. And those 9 chapters revolved around 288 pages of insights. That was one of the first, not the first, but was certainly one of the first fire service textbooks that focused in on building construction, identified strategy, tactics, talked about safety, talked about risk, talked about influencers of size up, fireground decision making. And although in a subtle manner, some things were very, very direct that Frank Brannigan talked about, but that first edition in 1941 was very, very critical. And again, I'm going to make reference to I have the first edition here in front of me, and again, it was a guide that was published by the NFPA at the time, but again, 288 pages, just 9 short chapters, and those chapters were included topical areas as follows: introduction, which was just talking about the fire problems, talking about some of the aspects of materials, some of the issues dealing with some general, very, very general insights on building codes, the aspects of building materials, the classifications of structures, and as Brannigan talked about, the mix and match. So even that term, we talk about this today in terms of hybrid structures, but it was mix and match. And the mix and match in buildings, as he referred to it back in 1971, revolved around the mixture of various types of materials that, again, are very commonplace currently when we talk about hybrid and performance-based codes. But again, I mentioned just a moment ago, our fire ground was very prescriptive, which led to very prescriptive building construction, very prescriptive buildings that matched up with the approved and consistent and generally accepted models and work practices of strategy and tactics and tactical windows on the fire ground, which were far more extensive than they are today. But so again, chapter 1 was the introduction. Chapter 2 was construction principles. Chapter 3, wood construction. Chapter 4, ordinary construction. Then that went into mill construction. He talked about the 19th century fireproof buildings, which is something that we are not talking anywhere nearly enough about, as well as mill or heavy timber construction. And then chapter 7, fire resistive or resistance construction, that was explained. It really did not go into great detail. There was only less than 8 pages that were part of that particular chapter. Some discussions on concrete construction, and it rounded out on steel construction. So very limiting in terms of the degree and depth, but nothing else. But for nothing else, that book was the first book that truly took building sciences and gave us some insights. It was identified and continues to be identified as a hard read. When we talk about building construction, building sciences, and so forth, and engineering, fire dynamics, again, it's highly technical based info. It aligns with a number of different areas of conversation and discussion, some different domains, some different content areas that are all intermixed. But again, the built environment, building construction, is not an easy read because of its technical basis, which is one of the reasons why many fire service personnel, especially in their early developing stages of professional growth as a newly minted and presented firefighter or fire officer, there is a tendency to just do the reads in order to get by on a promotional list, do the reads just to be able to pass an exam to attain certification, especially in today's realm. But it's once and done. And again, how many of you are going back? How many of you are staying abreast of construction? It is so far more than just stretching the line and going in, and that is why we're getting into this conversation. So again, building construction, very technical. We talk about limited scope and content. As I mentioned, the 9 pages, the format and the content followed a defined aspect of building types scoping. So we talk about the 5 fundamental building types, the textbook, again, not only that textbook, but it did create a very specific template of curriculum, the outline, and consistently impacts us today. So there are widening topics, widening domains. They are sometimes minimized and not maximized or extended. Again, there are aspects there that really demand of us sometimes to have a textbook just on one specific topic, let's say hybrid construction, or discussing even the topical area when we talk about old school operations, just ordinary construction and heavy timber mill, semi-mill construction, those particular construction aspects, both in terms of old school heavy timber, ordinary construction from the 1800s, early 1900s, could fill an entire textbook. And I will say this, that we are working on fine-tuning some of our proposals, and we are looking forward to possibly moving forward in a very expeditious and rapid manner here in the months ahead to do exactly that, to start filling in the gaps and developing comprehensive guides and instructional material specific to areas of construction that unfortunately are just relinquished to very limited scope areas within the chapters of just about any book that's out there currently. And again, the books that are currently being published do meet the general need, especially under the FESHES model. And that FESHE model that came out again back in the late 1990s, which deals with fire and emergency services, higher education. That initiative was attempting and did initiate standardize the curriculum for both 2 and 4 year fire science programs for the fire service, but again created a template that has become challenged and is challenging when we take a look at the degree of depth that is needed in those particular areas. There are widening special topics. There are other challengers and influencers to knowledge, skills, and abilities. It is a simplified approach, but really demands a much more expanded and higher technical approach toward it. And again, unfortunately, there's just this degree of complacency from a variety of different reasons, whether it be the lack of comprehension for publishers to recognize the importance of expanding curriculums. There are economic and financial stressors that come into play when we challenge some of the status quo regarding what is needed in terms of content. But again, we are optimistic that we can make some significant changes and maybe changing that course in the near future. And I'm very confident that the manner in which we are proceeding, especially with some specific groups that we are approaching, is going to make all of the difference. So again, today's challenges: building construction sciences, methods, materials, the modern method of construction, building performance, architectural engineering, fire protection engineering, fireground management operations, the risk management factors, the varied along with the aging infrastructure, the variety of codes, performance-based applications, occupancy risk, the variations, hybrid construction technology, and the continuing aspects dealing with the financial elements that go into the manner in which buildings are developed, which goes back into the challenges of training, competency, skills, knowledge, the baseline knowledge for officers, commanders, incident commanders, the modular domains that and functional areas that are needed. We need to expand, align, and really take into account some of the emerging technical challenges that are present both in the rural, suburban, and urban type settings. And again, it's interesting. Just recently, we traveled around the United States. We had about a week's worth plus of training opportunities in different regions of the U.S., some of which, again, were very rural, and in others were very urbanized. And it's just interesting to note that even in a somewhat rural setting, or less than urban setting, and I wouldn't even call it a suburban setting, but the conversation revolved around an emerging type of building construction that's becoming very commonplace throughout the United States, and that's podium construction. And one of the individuals during our line of presentation raised that question, saying, hey, we've got this particular unusual construction type that's going on. And the more that they were trying to explain that, the quicker we were able to recognize. And we mentioned the term podium construction, gave some further insights on how that building was built. And sure enough, the student said, yep, that is the building. And that's going up in a relatively rural / suburban environment that further reinforces this notion that this particular construction type, although a smaller footprint, is becoming institutionalized, is becoming very recognizable in all settings, and typically will very well in a short period of time become very common. So again, it's not primarily the focus here is that it is not just something you're going to find in a very large urban metro type of first due area or response area and such. You very well may be finding these in settings that are non-traditional and necessarily not expected. But just about everything today is going to be found from the smallest to the largest, from the most simplest settings to the most complex and such. So that is safe to say from that standpoint. So again, it goes back to this need for some different influencers on curriculum and training. I did make mention that the FESHE model, again, really set into motion much of what we are suggesting. We're suggesting that there may be this is the right time to have a relook, to take a look at and re-examine and reassess where we are within the built environment, where we are at regarding the fire service, where we are at regarding insights derived and attributed toward research and R&D, the science portion of, again, building construction, the science of engineering, architecture, the fire science arena, as well as the aspects of emerging fire science theories that are coming about and reinforced or expanding upon from what we are getting from R&D. So, I think that it's important to note that the FESHE model, as it relates to the curriculum outline, may suggest us revisiting where we're at today, and highly suggests that a new type of outline that takes into account all of these emerging areas to give us a better curriculum that aligns with possibly 3 distinctive areas of operation: that type of rural setting, the type of urban, suburban type of setting, and then certainly the urban metro environments, because each one of those 3 categories, if we try to generalize them, do have very distinctive training and operational needs based upon the types of risks, based upon the types of construction that one cannot attain when you pick up any specific one textbook that's out there and try to train to that textbook. You are going to be cherry picking and selectively choosing the extent and the depth of material that one is going to cover, because there very well may not be applicability for the kinds of things that particular book is attempting to cover from chapter 1 to whatever the end chapter is. So we mentioned that, again, one of the most leading textbooks that are out there is and continues to be Building Construction for the Fire Service, first edition, 1971, the most current edition, the 2019 edition, the 6th edition to that. And again, I'm going to read right from my current aspect. There are, again, 14 chapters, but again, the chapters continuously align with the previous chapters and editions. There are a number of changes that have occurred over the number of years. I think that it's safe to say that, in my opinion, the 3rd edition of Brannigan's Building Construction for the Fire Service probably was the most complete at the time it was in which it was published, and that was in 1992, and that consisted of 643 pages. But again, it's a long way from 1992 here to 2024. So Glenn Corbett certainly has done a significantly phenomenal job as a current author. Brannigan is currently still listed as an author on again, Brannigan's Building Construction for the Fire Service book, as it's currently referred to and such, and continues to do a good job to continue to move that book forward. But with that being said, again, it's highly suggested that some different curriculum areas be looked at. And it's safe to say that when we talk about the complexities of the built environment, there's a lot to it. And no one single standalone textbook can fulfill all of those needs. One of the things that we have conceptualized is a different approach toward that, which we are working and moving forward with here in the upcoming couple of weeks or months to actually present those concepts and see if we can move that ball forward with some published books here in a very, very short period of time. So as I mentioned, the curriculums do follow that FESHE curriculum guide that are consistent with the National Professional Development Modeling and those particular standards. So let me take a step back, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things here as we start moving toward sort of closing out on this particular edition of our topic. It's safe to say that we will have a part 3 to the series. There's still quite a bit more to discuss. We're sort of approaching that 60-minute mark here for our episode here. And as you're well aware, sometimes we do get into some rather extensive content and conversations that leads to a 2-hour podcast and webcast program. But in the interest of efficiencies, we will sort of get to a conclusion point here relatively soon, but we will have a part 3 to wrap up specifics dealing with our suggested curriculums and such. One of the things that I do want to make mention of is that I made a statement about Brannigan's Building Construction for the Fire Service book not being the first book on building construction for the fire service. And some of you have heard me mention this in the past on a couple of other episodes when the opportunity presented itself. But the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the IAFC, in 1932 published the Fire Chiefs Handbook, and that is considered the first comprehensive textbook. The first comprehensive textbook for the fire service, again, was issued in 1932. And that particular book, again, has a wealth of insights in so many different areas, one of which, again, we have talked about extensively. We've talked about some aspects of size up and so forth in there. It talks about the development of the initial the initial plan of operations, but it was one of the first books. It was the first book that talked about size up as related back to the type of construction related back to building heights. So it started getting into some aspects of building construction, the development of fire within the building, the aspects of each type of building construction that was common in that particular area, that when they referred to it, that had very specific characteristics. And those characteristics, again, were defined by a very emerging type of construction that, again, when we take a look at the 32 years from the 1900s to around 1932, a lot of dynamics within society, within the built environment, a lot of different changes going from just common tenement firefighting, brace frame construction, wood frame construction, brick and joist construction, ordinary construction, mill and heavy timber construction, and we started seeing the emergence of the high-rise constructed building and a variety of new kinds of materials that were introduced, thus the need to change up our training and such. So that first textbook in 32 talked about types of construction, the development of fire travel, construction related to characteristics based upon evolving building construction. And then also in that book talked about ventilation practices, talked about the carefully fought fire. It was the first book that introduced the concept of fighting fires from the interior. And many of you may not recognize that, but that is the Genesis book, both in terms of opening up, in terms of providing ventilation to the building, which at the time was considered poor practice to open up the building. And that term actually comes from, again, that 1932 edition of the IAFC's Fire Chiefs Handbook. So again, construction was started to be discussed in that particular area, but certainly not to the extent of it. Brannigan, again, in 1971, introduces us to the principles of construction and then starts talking about those as they relate back to the NFPA 220 standard, types 1 through 5. We talk about, fire resistive, non-combustible, ordinary construction, heavy timber construction, and then wood construction. Those continue to be conversation elements, but they are lacking. So if we talk about wood frame construction, there's a whole variety of different types of wood framing systems. And no, not any one particular book delves into the level of detail that one can extract from it when we talk about wood framing, all the way from the timber framing systems, which go into heavy timber as they evolve, but all the way to engineered structural systems that we have today. And again, the continuing evolving type of framing systems that revolve around engineered structural systems, as well as, again, a new type of type 4 construction that you may not be aware of that revolves around mass timber construction. So we do have a new hybrid type, or a very distinctive type of type 4, which is not considered heavy timber, but is considered mass timber, of which there's a number of different types of building materials, their applications, and so forth, that all, again, go back to the need for additional training. So, again, the continuing aspects here go back to the training, the competencies, the skill set levels, outlines, and so forth that may or may not be derived from a variety of different resources as such. So we, again, just touched upon and expanded upon some aspects that we laid the groundwork out on part 1. We've expanded those a little bit more so here on part 2. Again, when we take a look at the dependent areas, when we talk about the built environment, architectural engineering, building sciences, fire protection engineering, these are all dependent professional disciplines that all revolve around, and they all have a very stable and rapid evolution to aspects that go into how buildings are being built. But we on the fire service side continue to be challenged by keeping up with all of those elements. I believe that, again, that lack of consistent training within the areas of building construction hampers and handicaps us when we do show up on the fire ground. I think that there is a lack of embracing the area of building construction as a curriculum area that demands of us to have continuous in-service training, at least on a quarterly, or certainly, if nothing else, semi-annually, but at least on a quarterly basis. There should be a focus on building construction related skill sets to expand upon the reset that hopefully we've done at some other point within our training academies, within our training divisions, within our training committees, our training departments, that we've stopped and dedicated the appropriate level of baseline training. So do a reset, go back to fundamentally and apply that back to where you're currently at in terms of your response area, your jurisdiction, your communities, your battalions, your divisions, your response areas. You know, what is present within your communities, both new and old, and do a reset on developing and presenting an adequate, in-depth level of training that gets everyone up to speed. And that can be done initially at the company and command level, and then roll that out to as part of an in-service program or typical types of multiple deliveries within the training drill cycle for your organizations to get everybody up to speed that, again, may have a varying level of experience and skill set level. Get everyone up to speed and then start focusing in on some curriculum areas that we're going to talk about more so in our part 3 episode. Fundamentally, I'm going to leave you with this. When we talk about the 4 reads of the fireground, again, we talk about reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the compartment, reading the company. We also talk about suggested filtering of 5 specific areas that are common to all building construction. And again, this is the roadmap. This becomes the template that we have been advocating over the last 20 years as we continue to develop and hone and continue to even evolve our model. But again, that first arriving construction, that influences tactics, that influences our level of risk, construction tactics and safety for that first arriving, that critical 15 to 20 minute window, of which the most critical truly is that 10-minute operational window before we hit a benchmark that might suggest some other areas of operation. but there are 5 critical domains that we are going to talk a little bit further about as they relate back to training, and that is the building anatomy and the era and vintage in which that building was built. It's the occupancy type, use, and characteristics of the building from an occupancy-driven standpoint. That's number 2. The third area is going to be the collapse and compromise characteristics of that particular building or all buildings. So all buildings, the most critical element that we can further develop knowledge, skills, curriculum, and training on is the characteristics of compromise and collapse. The fourth area is the methods and materials of construction that are all critically tied into occupancy type and usage, but more critically are tied back into the building construction. What is the building's anatomy? What's the era and vintage? So when was it built, relatively speaking? How it was built, what meaning the types of systems and components that go into it. And again, it goes back to that fourth element dealing with the methods and the materials of construction that went into that building at the time of initial construction or at the time of renovation. So we're also saying that this is applicable not only when it was built, but in the different life cycles of the building as the building undergoes different changes in different periods of time. So that is also era and vintage driven. And then the fifth piece, which revolves around the aspects of fire dynamics. How does fire travel? How does it communicate? How does it affect the methods and the materials of construction? That affects the collapse and compromise. That affects the level of resilience, integrity, and time. How does it affect the building? So we're going to talk a little bit more about how to get into that point of context, some suggested areas of conversation where we have identified some different modeling for the suggested curriculums, but they are going to revolve around those common themes. They're all going to relate back to emerging aspects of research and science. They're going to be built upon our code provisions, but it's going to give you a different set of parameters of how to study any building as it relates to the types of structures in your, let's say, your first due or your predominant jurisdiction of your entire department, as well as the kinds of things that one would look at from a mutual aid or greater alarm response areas that go outside of the normal, consistent day-to-day boundaries of your organization. So we'll talk a little bit more about those. I will leave you with the one other comment here as I look for my last note here to give you another takeaway. So another great starting block when we say, well, I can't wait for my training committee and my training department, my bureau, my academy to develop the training drill schedule or to develop the next drill or in-service for my battalion, my companies, my department, and so forth. But for those of you that want some immediacy, I'll give you 2 suggested takeaways here to help provide some guidance to you. First and foremost, there are a number of textbooks that are out there that will help you delve into, and if you don't have these books on your library shelf currently, I'm highly suggesting you to obtain them. So there's a whole variety, whether we talk about building construction for the fire service book, the ISTA book on building construction, the most current edition of Chief Vinnie Dunn's Battle Space, talking about a variety of different aspects of construction in those areas, as well as some of the other vintage books that have been published previously, which includes The Collapse of Burning Buildings by Chief Dunn, as well as Fireground Size Up from Chief Mike Turpak. Certainly another 2 critical books that, although are a little bit more costly in terms of that investment, they are an investment, whether you are at the volunteer or the metro size type setting, and that is inclusive of the NFPA Fire Protection Handbook, as well as the Society of Fire Protection Engineers Fire Protection Handbook. Those 2 are very, very critical. They are the most technically advanced that are out there, but both of those handbooks are very, very critical for any emerging or practicing officer on today's fire ground. Again, regardless of organizational structuring, whether it be the volunteer or the career side of it, from rural to metro. But certainly one of the most economical books that every single firefighter, every single fire officer, every single incident commander, regardless of rank or experience, is a must-read to either attain the right level of insights and knowledge, the KSAs, that will support your developing experience on the fire ground, and that is Francis Ching's Building Construction Illustrated. That is the most influential book that I've ever have had the opportunity to read, in conjunction with many of the other fire service books that are out there. But it is the best non-fire service related book that you can attain. It is a illustrated guide to building construction, as the title refers to. First published in 1975. I have that first edition that I attained and purchased when I was in college, going to school to become an architect at the time. And that book still sits on one of my shelves here in my studio in my home office. So Building Construction Illustrated, Francis Ching, Ching. You can order that book very easily on Amazon.com. And again, older editions don't have some of the most up-to-date insights on new construction, but I would encourage you to obtain that and purchase that particular book. And lastly, one of the other things that you can very quickly and very easily do, and I would encourage our training officers that are listening to this and chief officers, take advantage of the self-study that the National Fire Academy has for a up-to-date and revised training module. Previously, these modules that were being delivered as part of a two-part weekend 12-hour type program, there were two building construction series face-to-face presentations that had been utilized since the late 1990s up until the last few years. But there is a new self-study book. It's a 6-hour self-study program. It's called The Principles of Building Construction. The class code is Q0751. You can find that on the National Fire Academy website. Take a look at the self-study guides. Again, it's a self-study guide that gets into the principles of protected and non-protected, non-combustible type construction, masonry, heavy timber, and wood construction. So for those of you that are looking to attain some formal training, you can do this on your own time in a self-study manner. I would encourage our training officers and chief officers, company officers, approach your department, especially on the volunteer side. Get everyone the opportunity to take this particular class at their convenience within a particular period of time. Let's say you give them 6 weeks to be able to take the 6-hour class at their own pace, but at the time in which the program is completed and they are able to download their certificate of completion, the other plus is that you can hopefully give them, if your procedures allow it to, give them drill credit for completing that class. At least you've raised the bar in terms of a baseline level of knowledge, and then tie that back into some of your training, both your in-service training, your drill training, your company level training, your departmental, your battalion level training, and so forth. So some good insights, 2 takeaways on 2 specific books, Building Construction Illustrated, and then the self-service training modules through the National Fire Academy. Again, another tremendous opportunity for you. So we're going to close out this edition of Buildings on Fire, taking it to the streets here, for part 2 of our continuing series on building construction training. And we will wrap up our conversation here next month. We are now regularly scheduled each month on fireengineering.com, and we come about and are very happy to say that on the 4th Thursday of each month, you'll be able to listen to our podcast and look at our webcast program here as you currently are doing. But again, each month we will be coming and presenting to you a variety of different timely topics and supplementing what we are able to do here on fireengineering.com platform, but also expand upon some things that we are very diligently working towards achieving. We've talked about this on a couple of programs that we very well and very are looking forward to doing with fire engineering, with Chief David Rhodes and the entire staff, to continue to promote and expand upon some things that we have been quietly trying to achieve, and that is inclusive of some online writings, some expansive writings, some online downloads that'll supplement our monthly program here on our podcast. We're going to look to do some video clips and some other things that we're working forward to doing. So keep an eye on that. We are moving very deliberately forward. It's been a year process since we first introduced this concept back to everyone there at Fire Engineering, but we are very confident that we're going to approach a time here in which enough's being said. You're going to see some results of a lot of behind-the-scenes efforts to really push this curriculum area, push forward the aspects of importance of building construction that tie into so many other things that we do on the fire ground. We do have a couple of other quick announcements here. Our next Buildings on Fire New York City walking tour that many of you continue to become involved with by participating. Chief Danny Sheraton and I, again, present a walking tour. We take the classroom to the streets, and this is our sort of Disneyland tour of the built environment. So our next installment of our walking tour, doing Reading the Building Reads in the Streets of New York City. It's a full day effort. Our next tour is scheduled for Saturday, August 3rd. You'll be seeing some upcoming postings and so forth for that. We do have a specific webinar that we are going to be presenting on June 12th. We will have both a daytime as well as an evening session that will give us some opportunities to talk about the Fire Officer's Guide to Today's Building and Construction. It'll be a 3-hour program dedicated specific to some very key elements here that are part of our conversation that we've had, both in terms of this particular episode, our previous episodes, as well as our conversations on other presentations. It will tie into some further insights on the commercial fire ground, as well as talking about the fundamental 5 building types, hybrid construction. So keep an eye out for that. We do have a new rollout of a panel conversation that will be coming about each month. Take a look at that. We have a new Facebook page that's rolling out called Reading the Building, and that'll be published here shortly by the latter part of June. I think our rollout date is June 25th, if not sooner, so keep an eye out for that also. So again, our next show is scheduled for June 27th. We will round out our conversation here on curriculum and training for building construction. So until next time, companies are in quarters and off the air. Stay safe, but keep in mind there's a job being worked somewhere in the streets in your city, across the country, and around the world, doing what we do best, and that's being who we are, and that's firefighters. So take care, everyone. Stay safe, train hard. Reach out to me if you have some further questions on any of the topical areas. And again, by all means, please go back into the archives here on fireengineering.com for not only many of our programs, but some wealth of other presentations that are done by the entire staff of colleagues that represent the Fire Engineering podcast series, and now our webcast programs that are part of this continuing, evolving, and exceptional array of offerings that fire engineering has always been known for and continues to move forward with passion and with focus and with dedication for you, our brothers and sister firefighters that are out there trying to make a difference in your community. So stay safe. Until next time, this is Chris Naum signing off, and we'll see you next month on the next edition of Buildings on Fires, taking it to the streets.
Like a trusted turnout jacket you've had for years, Flex 7 outer shell fabric delivers a perfectly broken-in feel on the very first wear. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology, Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tenkatafabrics.com/flex7. Flex 7, powered by enforced technology. Only from Tenkata Protective Fabrics.